Cool. As always, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions I've been meaning to ask for a while.
Hey.
And first one, what I noticed while interacting with you is that you have a completely different way of thinking. And to me, so I'm going to try to put that into words what I mean.
Okay.
It feels like other people learn about complexity and then they do something with it, but it feels like you were born in it. Like you were, it feels like, and I have a different question that kind of is in the same vein, but to you, it feels like the mechanistic mindset is something that is very alien to you. And I don't think I've ever asked you this, but what do you consider your main influences? And I'm not necessarily talking about academic things, but what contributed to you developing this kind of worldview?
To me, it's interesting because it doesn't feel alien to me, even though maybe it feels like, for me, everybody kind of is this way. Like everybody has this orientation to the complexity of the world and themselves. If I really look at it, I think, there's retrospectively some things that become coherent that contributed to it. I grew up in a really small town that, I think oftentimes there's the complaint about small towns, that they're insular, that they're protected, that they're isolated, that they're, not diverse, that they're all of these things. And while those things are very true, there's also really interesting complexities with small towns. And one of the complexities in the town I grew up in was, or maybe not complexities, but deviations, let's call it that. One of the positive deviations of the town I grew up in was that we had a kindergarten through 12th grade school system. And so everyone went to school together for 13 years, right? In the same building.
Wow. And
in my hometown, educators, teachers were by far the highest paid, most respected profession in the town I grew up in. It's a rural town, upstate New York. We had dairy farms. We had some artisans and kind of new age hippies. We had some, older folks that just lived in the town. And education was, because we had, what they called a central school system at the time. Teaching was at least looking back, seems like it was at least the most stable job, if not close to the highest paid, most respected profession in town. And when I look back, that really made a huge difference on me, plus the fact that we had to live together as a community in the school for 13 years. I also had the privilege of, from sort of first until fourth grade, going to very alternative schools that weren't necessarily, they weren't like Montessori schools. They weren't, they didn't come from a tradition, they weren't attached to a particular kind of educational style. They were kind of now that I've learned the histories of them, they were self-organized schools. It was like families got together with a couple other people and they started these two schools. And so they had integrated classrooms, for instance. So from first to second grade, I was together with first to fourth graders. And then third and fourth grade, I was together with third to sixth graders, all in the same classroom. Lots of self-directed learning. So the second school that I went to, we basically had a grid that, and I'm not sure I completely remember this, but in my memory, this is the way it worked. We had a grid for each day of the week. And then we had minimum specifications for our own learning. It was in the week, you have to do 4 math related things. You have to do 4 science related things. You have to do 3 art related things. But for each of those, there were a range of options, you know? So like for the first hour of the day, you could go play in the sandbox, right? And that would count as a physical thing. But what you couldn't do was play in the sandbox for 3 hours in a row, nor could you play in the sandbox as the first thing 5 days in a row, right? So there was both clear specifications and complete autonomy within that, right? Well, not complete, but high degrees of autonomy and freedom within that. And then when I came back to public school in my hometown, and I was there for 12 years or something, or 8 years, or whatever the math would work out to be, you just learn to like, I don't know, you just figure it out as a community of young people who are in school together. You know, it's just like you've been with these people since you were 3. Like I went to preschool with most of them. And the town didn't have a lot of people leaving and coming. There were some, but for the most part, I literally was with the same 65 people I graduated high school with since kindergarten. Like I had known them since kindergarten or before. And so for me, that both reinforced this deep commitment to relationships, to place, to community, without it being explicit though. It was not like some, you know, like little utopian place where it's like, oh, we're a community. The hippie schools were maybe a little bit more like that. But the public school was not that way. It wasn't like trying to create this like specific community. I mean, like we had an I think he was a Marine. Ex-Marine was our principal. So like pretty like structured, not into real, you know, particular kinds of community ideas that come from certain sources. And then after that, when I got to college, like dance became an important avenue for me to explore complexity. That was not intentional. I just kind of like, I'd done a little bit of dance when I was younger. Like I had this community art center in our town, and you know, went to dance classes while I was 6 or 7 or something. Never thought anything more of it. And then got to university and showed up to dance class, and in retrospect it was a very interesting thing. I think for me throughout, and this is a long way of getting at it, I just like the breadth of things. I like the full expansive role that our imagination plays. It just keeps things more interesting and fun and lively and compelling when we don't compress or flatten or diminish things. And, you know, I'm prone to doing that. We all do that at different times. But I just think I'm more fun. And maybe that makes me a hedon. I just want things to be pleasurable for the most part. But it's also just like, I don't know, it's more lively.
But does it make it difficult sometimes interacting with other people? So do you ever stand in front of the group and they completely don't get what you're trying to say?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like when I try and explain panarchy, it's a nightmare. Like it's a complete, like I like have got to figure out a different way, because I start with like whales dying in the ocean. And like, especially if you're doing that like second day of a workshop in the middle of the afternoon at 2 p.m. You know, some people in The Hague probably are still confused by trying to describe panarchy through dead whales. And you know, I how do I describe this? I think people, I have no clue. Let me just say this. I have no clue what people understand or don't understand, or what the duration or time horizon is of their understanding. And I don't have any attachment to whether or not they get what it is. I trust that everybody's brain will take in things and rearrange things on its own. and we don't have to control that. We can't even really directly influence that. We can only indirectly provide, things that, cause the brain to need to rearrange itself. And sometimes the brain will do that, and sometimes it won't, and we have no idea if it's going to happen or not, and it doesn't really matter, ultimately. We can't really measure it, we can't really predict it, we can't really control it, and so, I don't know.
Yeah, sounds about right to me. Yeah, it resonates with me so much.
Yeah.
And just going a bit further into that whole complexity view, I remember you once telling me that the whole idea of a goal is incomprehensible to you.
Oh yeah, goals. Yeah. So the way I described a goal the one time to myself was like, a goal is a past state you want to look back on from the future. So like you never want to like my challenge with things like goals is that they feel very static. They feel very controlling or narrowing, and like I don't know. I also I don't have particular ambition, and I don't get satisfaction from achieving things, I guess. I like to be good at stuff. Yes, I like to be good at things, but I don't have things that are specific ambitions that I'm trying to make happen in the world. I don't have things that I'm trying to achieve. And so for me, goals are just less relevant, less interesting, less motivating. And when we do have them, I think, again, there's something you want to look back at your goal. And it's I think of it as the mountains beyond mountains beyond mountains thing. Because you're traversing, and it's nice to look back and see all the mountains that you crossed or all the territory that you covered. And I also feel honestly, my orientation to the future is I am backing my way into the future. I might be able to put my hands out and feel some stuff behind me, so that I don't completely, run into something horrible. But I do not feel like I can turn peek over. I barely can I can peek over my shoulder, but there's a complete fog behind me, and we're just kind of slowly backing our way into the future. And to me, a goal feels like you have a headlamp and you turn around and then it points at a particular place. And because there's fog, the headlamp might clear the fog in that spot, which is cool. If you want to go to that spot, cool, that's your spot, go to it. I'm interested in what's around the spot. I want to know everything else that's around it. Getting to that spot is not compelling for me.
So when we talk about goals, to me, a wider concept would be purpose.
Uh-huh.
And I also remember you telling me recently that you stopped doing collective purpose. You stopped looking for collective purpose. Is that still the case? And what do you do instead?
So I think there's, at least if you're going to do, for me, something around purpose, it needs to be plural. It needs to be purposes. And there's often multiple, and the panarchy has become such a key way for me to kind of relate to things. There's often going to be multiple purposes at multiple scales that are simultaneously complementary and competing with each other. And so for me, it's the same thing as why is variability good in our organizations? Why is variability good in our lives? Why is variability good in our purpose? Because it adds vitality. It adds strength. It adds resilience. It adds, whatever language you want to use there. Adds adaptability. And so to have multiple purposes at play at any given time I feel and have, I think, found both invites, more people to look at their work in more ways, more complex ways. They can orient what they do to these multiple lenses. So to me, purpose is just like a lens. And I think the unreliability of language means that trying to do collective work around purpose is very complicated. Because that simple Gareth Morgan thing around what is the pig? Well, the pig is, a mammal, it's a police officer, it's a messy person, it's an investment, it's, right? And so if you're gonna rely on purpose, a statement, as a thing that people use tangibly to guide their work, well, you're kind of in trouble because nobody's going to understand those words to be the same thing, even though you've created the illusion that those words can be interpreted in the same way. And so for me, I've been really interested in, yes, articulating purpose or purposes for within a group, orienting to which of those purposes feel relevant at a given moment, and then really using kind of the narrative side of our work, or of something like 9 Whys. So I don't really like 9 Whys as a structure, but I do like the narrative dimensions of it, which is encouraging each of us to be able, or invite each of us to put our own language, our own vocabulary to the reasons that the work is important to us. And the us can be the individual us, me, or us, the collective. And so I think that work of inviting each person to articulate for themselves in their own language, using their own vocabulary, in stories, in conversation to describe what's important to them is helpful. But to compress or collapse all of that into a couple little statements, other than for the effort of, everybody engaged simultaneously in doing that, I don't think the statements are what matters. It's the relational work, it's the narrative work that's happening as people work with their own language to articulate something about what's important.
Beautiful. Yeah, it also kind of echoes some of my own experiences with the whole thing. And yeah,
it's the same thing as goals. It's like, if you're, and I don't have any, I think it's just my own aesthetic preferences. I'll be very clear about that. It's like, if people feel like they want or can work towards very specific goals or have a very tangible, focused purpose, I don't have any, like, I might not find it that attractive myself. I might sound very judgy about it, but that's just my personality. That's not my actual belief. It's not like I think that that's, or feel like that's actually a bad choice to make. And indeed, I can feel envious of them that they got to a point where they were able to articulate something so tangibly, coherently, and directly. So there's a mix of like kind of envy, like, oh man, I wish I could get that clear about my own stuff. And at the same time, a little bit of like, and there's more stuff at play than just that. Yeah. And at least for me, that's why the process matters, is like, are you arriving? There's this funny little, I don't know where it came from, this funny little quote or aphorism that a conclusion is the place where you got tired of thinking. And sometimes I feel that way about purpose. It's like, we got too tired, so we just had to put something down. And this is what we put down.
right.
Or did you get beyond the threshold of exhaustion and tiredness and explore the full thing, and then came out of it really, truly, coherently understanding what the purpose is, or purposes are. So, however that works for each individual person is the way it should work for them.
Okay, something else. To me, you're one of the people who bring a lot of novelty into the Liberating Structures community. And I feel like you're responsible for a lot of the liberating structures that are in development. Is there some kind of, I mean, I know you, so I think I know the answer to the question, but I'm trying to get you to talk. Is there any kind of process to you developing new liberating structures? So how does it happen? Do you just have an idea sometimes? Is it like a fully formed structure that pops up in your head, or?
No, so I think that there's the two scales of it. There's like what actually happens, and then why is it important for me? And we can have all sorts of great debates about whether it's helpful to have like an infinitely deep pool of liberating structures or a very curated, confined. Like, I'm not going to talk about that. That's a whole other set of things. For me, it's the reason that I like to think about new structures or work on new structures is because it renews the practice for me. It's a generative act that truly is renewing of my own practice with the structures, because it helps me understand that micro design logic that Keith and Henry put a lot of effort into developing. Like, does that DNA actually generate as much novelty as I think it does? Does that underlying structure truly provide us with opportunities to produce or create new structures that are more responsive, more coherent with individual contexts, whether they spread or not? But for me, the place it always starts with the name, which is silly and ridiculous. I find two words that I think go well together or are in some way silly in combination, and then write those two words down. And so it starts with the two words. Once in a while, it starts with like, oh, here's an unexpressed need that it's harder to see how the repertoire of existing structures might contribute. I don't tend to start there. I start in a much more absurd or speculative place with it. So there's usually three entry points. Sometimes there's a name. Sometimes there's like a really interesting, for me, attractive model or idea or concept or thing that's out there that would be interesting to translate into a structure that more people could use, right? So it's like there's something out there that's kind of like, oh, that's a cool, interesting thing that may not either A, have a lot of structure to it right now. It might be very abstract. It might be a practice that an individual person has developed, but is very much based on their tacit knowledge and practice, not their explicit knowledge and practice. And so it's that migratory translational work that I find very fun, to move from, oh, here's this abstract idea or thing, let's move it into something more tangible that we could mess around with and play with and more people might be able to use. And then the third avenue in is like taking two things and smashing them together, like the spiral journal. Taking Linda Berry's practice of having students draw spirals while somebody was reading, and have her very, very similar journaling practice that didn't necessarily involve spirals, put them together. Or grief walking, taking inspiration from Stephen Jenkinson's work around grief walking in hospitals, Joanna Macy's work around kind of the cycle from affirmation, despair, reconnection to hope, and figuring out a way to bring those together. And then the last place for me that's always been very generative is to look at the overall distribution of liberating structures and see which ones have high degrees of variation in the microorganizing elements. So the hypothesis for me has been like something like Troika and Conversation Cafe. And I did this with Charlie a couple times. The things that have a lot of specificity around the microorganizing DNA tend to be pretty robust and support a wider range of applications. So like Conversation Cafe has such a coherent, stable structure to it that it really supports a lot of variation in the invitation that you can use for it. Same with 1, 2, 4 All and impromptu networking and Troika. something like What So What Now What hasn't, and Triz, I would describe this way as well, have really great invitations, but the rest of the structure is a little like, okay, not as precise as some of the others, let's just say that. And so for me, it's been really interesting to think about taking either individual microorganizing elements like spatial arrangement and messing around or highlighting or emphasizing spatial arrangement to create more physical movement, or trying to develop a structure that, you know, does more specifically with 3, 4, 5 of the elements rather than 1 or 2. You know, and that's my analysis of each one. So like for me, you know, I think Triz is a really great, lovingly provocative invitation, and the rest of the structures just kind of a sequence of 1, 2, 4 alls, right? I'm interested in structures that don't always have to rely just on 1, 2, 4 all to be effective. That, like something like Troika, which really involves this very interesting spatial rearrangement, does something very important. Or, you know, so that's the other source for me, is taking either an individual micro design element or taking the idea that we want to specify more across different design elements. That's been way into it as well. But it's usually, honestly, it's just the name. It just starts with the name. It's like, oh, that's like, how can we develop a structure just so I can get to use that name? It's a terrible admission. It's shallow. Again, it's more on the like what's going to be pleasurable and fun side than the what's the hard work that needs to go into developing a new structure.
And it works really well.
It's fun. It's at least fun. I don't know if it works that well. It's at least like generates, you know, individual satisfaction.
Okay, 20-second bonus question. Cool. 10 people are coming over to your house for dinner. What do you cook?
What would I cook? 10 people are coming over. How much time do I have?
You have all day.
I have all day. Oh God. I might be in both my parents were chefs, and I grew up around my mom. And I would probably, you know, again, assuming dietary constraints are not a huge deciding factor, I would probably, this is gonna say a lot, I would probably get a couple sides of salmon, and I would roast the salmon with lemon, salt, pepper, and a little bit of honey, a little bit of olive oil, a little bit of honey. So I'd roast the salmon. I'd probably get some asparagus and either probably grill it if I could, and I would roast some potatoes and make a big salad. So I'd have a huge salad, roast salmon, roast potatoes, grilled asparagus.
Sweet.
Easy, ease. 10 people, a lot of people cook for.
Yeah, but that's, I like the basic.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Concepts behind it. That's the way I cook as well.
Yeah. Yeah. What's the thing that you can do that, you know, people can eat as much of as they want? There's enough variation, and you're not going to make a total mess out of your kitchen. And 2, you know, people may enjoy part of it, or can find some part of it that they enjoy.
Cool.
Thank you, Johannes.
Yeah. That was awesome. I think I saved at least half of my questions for next time.
Okay. Cool.
Cool. Thank you so much.
We'll do another one. Thank you. Good to see you.